Welcome back to more Interview with a Vampire fun. Today we're going to go over the 1994 Interview with a Vampire movie, starting with The Good Things. The 1994 Interview with a Vampire movie is a very authentic adaptation. While this movie does not cover the entirety of the book, it does cover the main thrust of the novel and one central emotional theme you can find in Interview. And since there's so much going on in Interview, I just don't think it's realistic for an hour and a half movie or even a 3-hour movie to tackle all of it. I really can see why Anne Rice thought that her chronicles would be better as a TV show versus a movie overall. And I don't think that a movie that includes every part of a book is necessarily a good adaptation. Overall, I just prefer this approach to adaptation where we pick one thing that we think is the strongest element and we really accentuate that and live in that moment instead of trying to cover everything in the book. So this adaptation focuses in on Louis and Claudia's relationship, that father-daughter dynamic, the whole loss of a child, dealing with a child that it has a problem that you cannot solve, all of those like thematic elements. And personally, since I think Interview with the Vampire is mostly about Claudia to start with, and Anne Rice has openly stated she wrote this book as a way for her to process her own grief over the loss of a child, there was a lot of marketable elements in centering this on a father-daughter relationship and the loss of a daughter, as well as a lot of strong supporting elements in the book. The most interesting and unique part of Interview with a Vampire is Claudia as this child vampire. So it makes sense to me, even in that angle, to want to explore that primarily. And the execution here in the father-daughter relationship between Louis and Claudia is excellent. Kristen Dunst as Claudia does a phenomenal job. I don't think anyone can ever do it better. And I'm kind of glad that we're unlikely to see another version of Claudia this young. I want to give credit to the writers and directors for picking out specific scenes for Kirsten Dunst to embody Claudia in. If you look at the entirety of everything in Interview with a Vampire and try to mentally picture like a child actually stepping into that role and playing it in theaters, I don't think all of it works on the big screen. And I don't think you can necessarily direct a child to do certain parts of that well. So it's better that they just focused in on what they knew they could get great dynamic scenes with, get that feeling and that evocative element forward without feeling this kind of cudgel to book loyalty all the time or covering the whole span of it. And beyond Kirsten Dunst's acting and the scene selection, I also want to give a shout out to the costume designers, because Claudia's clothes in the original Interview tell a story of her going from this childish mentality to this more adult theme, and it's told in part by her costume and clothing choices. So I love that they remained book loyal in this moment. We got these dazzling costumes, we could see really this whole journey told in just clothes. But when they do give Claudia reign to just be her full vampiric self, I love how she balances from that childish, innocent moment into this vicious killer. Even from the beginning, where they're dressing her up in a bunch of different kids' clothes, and that one seamstress pricks her finger and that sort of like triggers that hunter instinct in her. They just do such a great job showing us that Claudia is not what we expect. And I love how she can fly into this rage, rail at Louis or Lestat, attack them in one moment, and in the next minute be a contrite child who's sad, remorseful, looking for that forgiveness and love and assurance that all is well. There's just something so engaging and fascinating about those kind of characters. The way they portray Claudia in the book Interview with a Vampire is a little bit more cold, calculated, clearly 100% adult, and they sort of imply that some of her childish behavior is acting or tolerance on her part, like her fitting a role that people expect just so that she can go along to get along. And here in Interview with a Vampire movie, when Claudia is acting out these huge scenes and rages and stuff, we get more of that idea that like hormonally, brain chemistry wise, she might be stuck in a child's level, even with all this extra adult understanding and this time and experience, which I think was very unique at the time and has become one of the large standouts in vampire lore going forward. And I think it might be this movie that started it. Another thing I loved was Tom Cruise as Lestat. I was kind of hesitant going back to this movie after so long away. I thought maybe all I would see when I looked at Lestat was Tom Cruise, because generally speaking, when I see him play in movies, he's more or less playing a version of who I imagine that guy is in real life. And it turns out that I think he actually does a wonderful job here as like this villainous, arrogant, playful, fun, kind of like bombastic vampire. I guess there's more Lestat in Tom Cruise than I thought. Overall, I was fine that we introduced Lestat's powers a little bit earlier than we do in Interview with a Vampire. I don't love that he has them now instead of like gaining them through a whole series of trials, but I do understand the need to make the vampires more supernatural and more visually interesting in a movie setting versus in the book. And to that end, I was fine with like the veiny makeup and like the weird fingernails, finger situation going on with the vampires. I do think in later installments, Anne Rice does talk about how the fingernails look on the vampires, although we didn't get it in this one. The veins, I guess, make sense with the vampires being so pale, which is described in this book and other books, but I didn't love it like standing out on their faces. We probably could have done without torturing the actors so that they could trace the veins and do that makeup, but I get what they're going for and appreciate it. Lestat is played a little bit more sympathetically in this version than he is in the main book. I think since they were going to make a whole Chronicles of the Vampire series, he kind of has to be a little bit more sympathetic. There were a couple of reveals here about Lestat's past, like one-liners and stuff you don't get until later in the series. I'm a little conflicted about it existing here. As the whole movie stands, I think it works and I'm fine with it. It might even be good, which is why it's here. But of course I am conflicted, not just because of book loyalty, but because it does change the Lewis-Lestat dynamic a little bit in ways that I don't think serve Interview with a Vampire necessarily. It ends up being fine to me in this specific movie adaptation because we are so focused on Lewis and Claudia's relationship, and Lestat is really like a superficial side character almost. He still steals all the scenes he's in, and he is like the loud, bombastic character to Lewis's straight man, and almost every scene he's in with him. And you get a little taste of like why Lestat is so fun to watch and why he really took over the Chronicle of the Vampire series moving forward. I got used to Brad Pitt as Louis, and I've decided that his performance was fine to good. There were several moments where I was really buying it and enjoying it, and then there were just other parts where it felt like Brad Pitt had checked out of his performance entirely. We do change Louis' background a little bit, so instead of him losing his brother and going into a funk over that, he lost a wife and child, and that's why he's in like this funky state at the beginning. It really primes us for this like adopted surrogate daughter moment we get between Louis and Claudia, and that's really what this movie centers around. And then lastly, I'd say the special effects in this movie are pretty good. They're used very sparingly, but there's two specific moments I thought not only hold up very well, but are actually like kind of artistic and stylized in this time in a way that I just still really enjoy and vibe with. The first is going to be right when Louis is turned into a vampire. He looks at the statue of the angel, has closed eyes, and it opens its eyes and looks at him briefly. Not only was that very interesting to go with the description of him seeing things as a vampire as the first time where everything is changed and yet the same, but I just thought the effect was well done and like enjoyed it visually as like a surprising moment I didn't remember from any other watches of this movie. And then the second time is when they change Claudia from a dying young girl into a vampire. Her hair goes from like being raggedy to like these ringlet curls, and she goes from being exhausted and worn out into like this eternally youthful, beautiful, doll-like child. And I just thought the quick speed up transition of all of that was amazing. So moving into the meh. Changes to Lewis's backstory, while I think they serve the movie well, I'm also a little ambivalent towards it because changing Lewis's backstory to be this wife and child got rid of the brother element, and it cut out any further element about religion, mental illness, the supernatural, all of those heavy philosophical moments and topics we get in the book. And it also set us up so that we don't ever hear about Louis' sister or Babette, and both of those characters play a huge role in Louis' development, how he views the world. It sort of explains why he wants to be good and godly, even though he sort of suspects he can't be as a vampire. And like those two clashing, pulling elements drive so much of the Interview with a Vampire. It's kind of odd to not have them in an adaptation. I think they did an okay job on the portrayal of Lestat's death here in Interview with a Vampire. It's highly book accurate as far as the actual action pieces go of the scene, and I think the interaction between Lestat and Claudia, the fighting, all of that's done well. But what we're really missing from it is Lewis's response. And it would have been very easy to add his response in. All we need is like a moment of, instead of him being like dead-faced and like solely focused on Claudia and protecting her, like him looking at the body and being despondent or like showing pain, despair for like half a minute before we move on. Or when they were dumping the body, having Lewis actually walk out into the swamp, hesitate with the sheet-covered Lestat like staring down, have Claudia try to like snap him out of it, and then having him like reluctantly dropping the body into the swamp. Like those kind of short, quick things could have really made a big impact in that moment and really transformed the scene. Antonio Banderas' performance as Armand, this performance to me teeters on bad, but Armand is so infrequently in scenes, and they did have to change this character in some kind of way because it would have been really awkward for him to like actually have been a 14-year-old boy as described in Interview with a Vampire the book. And also there's not like a lot to work with when it comes to Armand's character in this first book. He's pretty mysterious, and it's hard to get like a good gleam as to how you should play or portray this character. And even in a performance that overall I think is terrible, there were like one or two very brief moments where I was like, yeah, I can see Armand in this character. It's not just a title name. But I do think as far as like portraying a character that's supposed to be a good mentor to Lewis and that's supposed to be like very patient and fully transparent and all of those things, Antonio Banderas did not do a great job with that. He really needed to speak a little bit more slowly, put a little more emphasis and weight in his words, and overall just have like a stronger, more commanding presence when he's on the screen. The overall presentation of the Théâtre des Vampires is fine, but it's not great. There were some more elements within the book than there is in this movie, and what they took from the book were some shocking visual moments, not necessarily the meaty intent and like drive behind it. The movie overall would have been enhanced with a little bit more Théâtre des Vampires because we get like more interactions between Lewis and Claudia, more of an idea about where Claudia is mentally, what she wants, how she's responding to other stimuli around her, the breakdown of her and Lewis's relationship and its eventual demise. All of that happens in these conversations and extra scenes that we lost. And I just think that I would have liked that extra time with Claudia. I would have liked as much as possible from this performance and movie. They excluded the entire part 2 of the Interview with a Vampire book, and I get why, because you can cut it out and lose pretty much nothing. But again, as this was a Lewis-Claudia moment, it would have been really cool to see the two of them journeying out on their own. And I would have loved to see like Kirsten Dunst pretending to be asleep and sweet while Lewis is getting like this story about these Eastern European vampires. I would have loved a scene where Claudia is like tossing stones at this vampire and eventually comes in like rips its skull apart. All of that said, I 100% understand why trying to portray a young girl ripping a creature's skull apart on screen never crossed the director's mind, probably. That level of gore and viscera might have been way too far. It really doesn't drive the story. Even in the book Interview with a Vampire, this whole like Eastern European vampires not being like other vampires is just kind of left out to dry. It's a dangling thread or a lore moment that I'm going to be looking for more details as we go further into the chronicles, and I don't recall if there actually is more or if this is just a loose end in the storytelling as a whole. Excluding more time with Madeleine, I get why for time purposes we don't get to see Madeleine and Claudia interact. I would have loved to see Madeleine tearing Paris apart, just like killing a bunch of people, Lewis like pulling her away. I would have loved seeing like that intense focus as she's like carving things and making dresses and doing all this cool stuff for Claudia. I would have loved to see a little miniature room made just for her size and having everything at her eye line. I just think the visuals of that would have been so much fun. Of course, the flip side of this is if we'd seen these parts of Madeline and Claudia's journey, we probably would have had to roll into Louis and Armand's conversation, and given that Antonio Banderas is such a terrible Armand, we're probably lucky we got less screen time with it. Next is going to be the Louis Lestat reunion at the end of the movie. It was fine. I think there's a good emotional core there. I think they captured the spirit of it really well, and they changed a couple elements to create more visual panache than there would have been in the book. And like line for line, it's almost exactly the same dialogue that we see in the book. So like I can't say it's a poor adaptation, but they do not include like that infant child within the scene. And I really think it loses something because of that. Because I've been thinking about the presence of that baby within the Louis Lestat relationship and the overfocus that Louis has on that child and like him taking care of it versus paying attention to Lestat. And I think it actually says a lot of interesting things about their relationship and like puts a lot of interesting questions thematically in our heads. All of those questions and relationship points directly go back to Louis and Claudia's relationship and remembering Claudia after she's gone. Like the suggestion that the two always need a child in between them to be even sort of kind of civil to each other. And whether it's Claudia or just like this random infant, Louis cares more about the kid in the room than he ever does about Lestat. And there's this interesting turnaround in their relationship when you have the infant in the scene, because Lestat originally saves Claudia from death by turning her into a vampire and bringing her into this vampiric family. And Louis saves this infant by taking it up out of the house with Lestat and returning it as an orphan to the mortal world and its mortal life. David's ending is different here in the movie than it was in the book. I think overall it's fine. It gives Lestat a chance to repeat this line that he told Louis at the top, which doesn't exist in the book, but is like a pretty good line that kind of like covers a lot of Lestat's mentality and gives us a little peek at his backstory. As a whole, I'm generally glad that both versions of the end of the interview exist, but I am a little conflicted that the ending changed because it does change some of the meaning of the story. And to that end, I'm also kind of meh about the hopeful elements in Louis's story, like when he sees the sunrise again in movies for the first time. This hopeful recovery style element after loss and grieving and mourning is important to portray. And in some ways, I think it's more realistic and true to like the process would be if you were immortal or if you were human. And it does transform part of the element that leaves me so sad and depressed when I like over focus on the book itself. But it also really changes the core meaning of the text, where Louis's conclusion is that he is sad and he will always be sad. He has been transformed into an evil, deplorable creature, and that's all he can ever be. He is never going to feel okay with himself or be happy again or get over Claudia or his brother or Babette or any of the other hundreds of deaths he's caused. There's something artistic and melodramatic and poignant and authentic in that you see in the book, and that feels like really grounded and connected to that mourning part of grief and loss, where the movie is portraying like the next step and is giving people light and like that push to go on. Again, I'm glad both versions exist, but as far as like how I feel about what the adaptation did and what it means as opposed to the source material, I'm a little ambivalent on it. So let's move right into the bad stuff. The depiction of Louis's slaves is pretty terrible. I have been considering putting this in the meh category because in 1994, this is like just the standard portrayal and depiction. But the truth of the matter is I like full body cringed when I saw it on screen and remembered that this was a stereotype that we all thought was like normal and a usual thing you'd see in movies. I think part of what tipped it over the edge for me is how the house slave is portrayed in it. She is dressed up and filmed and probably given direction to be like a quasi-sexual kind of object. Like she has like this whisper tone bedroom voice. She has like this slow, almost mesmerizing, like seductive movement towards Lewis. She like reaches out and touches him and keeps her hand on him in like lingering ways that, number one, don't feel like would happen because Lewis is now a cold vampire. I think she'd be like scared and like snatch her hand back when she sees how cold he is. And two, like she's just being so bold, sort of encouraging to do certain kinds of things when we haven't established a relationship between the two, really. It doesn't feel authentic to what a person in that situation would do. I don't think it accurately portrays the slaves as they're portrayed in the book either. And overall, it just left me feeling kind of like yucky and grossed out about the whole moment. I thought about like what I would have preferred to see because I was like, well, if I don't like this, then what would have been appropriate to me on screen, like that would have been book accurate and would have also been like more rounded, let's say. And it came to me right away. The slaves bunkering down for the night and Lestat like hunting them and like slowly picking them off, and the slaves finding the bodies the next day, and like all of them like whispering back and forth to each other and like creating these night watches and like trying to like catch these people out, and like side-eyeing this new guy that their masters let into the house and also side-eyeing him because he's being weird. So the depiction as it stands is plain out bad and pretty inexcusable. Doing this thought experiment about where I tried to think of what I would have preferred to see in Interview made me realize that I would love a whole ass horror movie with like the slaves discovering Lewis and Lestat are a vampire and try to like first prevent them from attacking and killing, and then try to actually drive them out and destroy them. The same way that recently this year we got a movie loosely based on Dracula's journey from Transylvania to London and the actual boat crossing. We could have like this little mini hour and a half long horror movie that developed this. That would be so cool to see. I also didn't like that we gave Lewis so much personal agency in this movie. For example, instead of the slaves uprising and attacking the manor and burning Point to lock down, Lewis goes out with this slave woman's body, announces that he's evil and corrupt, tells them they're all free now, whatever that means when you're about to destroy their home and presumably make it look like they killed him. But then he takes a torch and he like burns down his own home. And Book Lewis would never do this. He observes, he predicts, he's a Debbie Downer, he despairs, but he does not act. That's part of what makes the back third of Interview so powerful in the book. He finally stands up and takes action. And it's the first and only time Lewis is proactive or responsive to what's going on around him, instead of like just this outside observer letting things play out. And I don't understand why we have this moment where Lewis burns down his own house. Cinematically, it would be just as exciting to watch the slaves storm the house and burn it down and, you know, give them their agency and their power as much as possible. There's no Lestat reveal at the Théâtre des Vampires, and I think that's a huge missed opportunity. I would have loved just one more Lestat Claudia scene here, one more Lewis and Lestat scene, and it would have made their reunion in the back part of the book make more sense, because like Lestat is still there apologizing about Claudia, but he doesn't have the same level of context that he would have had if he had been at the Théâtre, revealing himself, showboating around, adding more tension and personal intent to that moment. And then lastly, I did not like that Lewis rejects Armand at the Louvre instead of going and touring the world with him. I don't like Antonio Banderas' portrayal of Armand, and part of me is like, let's just get him out of here as fast as possible. But at the same time, it's very important in the book he still chooses to go with him once everything is over. It's like him returning to this removed from the world, helpless kind of state. It's him signaling like his cold detachment and further evolution and like removal from humanity. And it also makes that one line where Armand shouts that he's dying make sense when Armand has been like trying to like revive himself and survive through Lewis for 100 years and still sees there's nothing there for him. Or like at this point in the Louvre when he's like, I'm dying. It's like, dude, you've known this guy like maybe a day and a half. You can find someone just like him, like out in the street. It's really not that deep. Also, I think the movie clarifies things that are best left ambiguous. Like Armand actually fully comes out and confesses that he is responsible for Claudia's death and that he's the one who told the vampires about Claudia and all of that kind of stuff. Even though I want to know whether or not that's what happened or not, whether or not he like sort of directed the vampires at the theater or just like allowed that crap to happen, I don't think him just coming out and saying it like that is satisfying or good. It feels just like really flat and cheesy and not fun. And I think in the book there's something to be said about how Louis continues to mourn Claudia while still trying to reconcile with Armand and move forward with a life together with him. It's saying something about grief and loss and like maybe two parents who have lost a child trying to move together after the loss of a child, or maybe they blame each other for that loss. Maybe one of them even has some culpability and like their eventual breaking apart and dissolution. And I find that element so powerful in the book and like such a direct allusion that I'm kind of sad we miss out on it here in the movie. To wrap this up, I love Interview with a Vampire the movie and Interview with a Vampire the book. I think it's an awesome adaptation, very true to the book in the parts it chooses to portray. And overall, I think thematically and emotionally, it hits very near the same elements of loss, grief, and mourning. Even though this movie is way older, it still holds up visually and is a really great watch. They have some huge star power in the movie and it pays off most of the time in most of the scenes. It's only an hour and a half. It's like a perfect vampire movie. And I can't encourage you guys enough, take a look at it if you enjoy Anne Rice's work. And as always, keep reading. Bye!